Welcome to another episode of the Cybersecurity Boardroom. I'm your host, Vince Shoto, and I'm joined by my co-host, T Soul. How you doing, T?
What's going on, Vince? I'm doing well.
Good, good. So what's going on this week, man? Why don't we get right into it?
Let's do it. So we've got all kinds of stuff. To begin with, we've got Amtrak. They actually experienced a breach that was reported to have happened between May 15th and May 18th. This breach actually didn't impact Amtrak's, like operational systems, but it impacted their guest rewards accounts. And it's kind of interesting. So there was a unauthorized third party that used compromised or previously compromised usernames and passwords from other previous breaches, to gain access to these user accounts. They compromised things like names, contact details, guest reward account numbers, even partial credit card numbers and expiration dates, gift card information and transaction history. And in fact, some of these accounts were even taken over, with attackers changing emails and passwords and looking for locking out legitimate users. But what's interesting to me about this is that there's a whole black market for rewards points. And so that was the goal here, is to get access to these rewards points and exchange them on the black market. That's interesting to me.
Do you think that people take their security on these rewards programs as seriously as they do on security for, let's say, their credit card or their bank account?
I mean, absolutely not, because you don't really think about that as even being on the radar, you know?
And so do you think then that companies that manage these rewards programs or that offer them have greater obligation to enforce security measures like multi-factor authentication, since people take it a little bit more lightly, therefore increasing the risk of something getting compromised?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a double-edged sword. I mean, in an ideal world, do they require MFA, multi-factor authentication? Sure, but how are they going to get people to comply with that?
Every
Especially
demographic. Well, I mean,
every
you can
demographic.
turn it
Exactly.
on and insist that everybody does it, but if you make things too difficult, I guess there's a balance, right?
Right.
Of, do I hit every demographic, and am I going to push people towards my competition because I make it more difficult to transact? So there's this balance, right? This
Mhm.
this moral obligation that you have towards your organization and safeguarding it, and safeguarding the people that interact with it, versus the need, not the desire, but the need to generate revenue for the business to sustain
Mhm.
and to grow. So that's something to consider. Multi-factor has been proven to be something that is more robust, that allows a greater level of security to reduce risk of compromise. There has to be a point in time where people aren't giving an option per se, but are provided with the requirement to adhere to those. And there's going
Yeah.
to be a tipping point, I think, when all these organizations are going to have no choice but to insist. And if everybody does it at the same time, then it's just going to be a new reality. And it's challenging for some people, but it eventually, I think, um, be stream or more mainstream.
Yeah.
You talk about the black market. There's a bunch of reason I think that black market thrives anywhere, right? But as it pertains to the rewards programs, I think of the fact that there's ease of transaction for being able to transfer, points from one person to another, that is not regulated by a banking authority, for example, or something that is independent of the program owners. That makes the transaction a lot easier. And so bad actors, would, I think, thrive in that type of environment because there's less regulation, less scrutiny. So it makes it for an easier transaction. The other thing is that there's a monetary value to these rewards.
Right.
The monetary value is not set by a government or an agency. It's a perceived value.
Hmm.
One company may tell you that their points are worth two times the points of another company, and you can trade some in, and you can, they basically set the value for it. So the bad actors themselves can turn around and leverage that perceived value
Yeah.
to make money off of it. And so it becomes a way of dealing with a currency that is not regulated and easy for the transaction to take place. And then the law enforcement, right? The enforcement of that, of the verifying that transaction, if you suspect that something went wrong, it becomes very challenging to deal with because you're
Because it's not
dealing
the
with
same.
ungoverned systems. They're not
Exactly.
centralized. They're not adhering to some type of protocol that everybody must adhere to 100% of the time. They can, but they don't always. And so that's difficult to enforce from a legal perspective as well. So that's, if you're a bad actor, I mean, that's easy pickings. Easy
Yeah.
pickings. I'd go
Yeah.
right at that.
Yeah. And with this one, for the end user, for the consumer, bottom line is this was perpetrated via credential stuffing. So they got your password from a breach that happened some time ago.
Yeah.
You may have gotten a notification about it. You've got to change your passwords when we become desensitized to these breach notifications. We don't recognize that, you might not immediately see an effect, from a breach, but somewhere down the line they may use that one password that you reuse for everything.
Yep.
It's out there. So
Absolutely. And do you necessarily feel like changing your password every time you get a notification? It's sort of this thing where, you take a risk. You take a
mhm.
risk. You just don't know how big of a risk you're taking. You never really know until it actually happens and you get breached. And I know
Yeah.
it's difficult to maintain all these different passwords and to continually change them and manage them.
hmm
But unfortunately, this is where when something gets compromised, you have no choice. You got to go through and you got to change all your passwords. You just do.
Vince, one of the things we always talk about is consequences,
Yeah.
for an organization who has, lax security posture.
Hmm.
And it's interesting, Blackbaud, they are a South Carolina based software company. They had a breach back in 2020. Actually, it was a ransomware attack. And so they've been sort of embattled from that, but they've recently been ordered by the California Attorney General's office to pay a $6.75 million fine for that ransomware attack that occurred in May 2020. The reason why they were ordered to pay this fine is because the Attorney General is alleging that Blackbaud made misleading statements about the data security efforts and the extent of the breach. Uh, and the thing about it is, this not the first fine or amount that they've had to pay for this breach. They were previously ordered to pay $3 million fine in March, and also agreed to pay a $49.5 million settlement with all 49 states, including DC.
That's big money.
For me, when you talk about reputation,
Mm.
when I see that you've got fines coming from California State Attorney General, you've got a settlement that you've had to pay out to all 50 states. I mean, they're still in business. People still use them.
So we talk about misleading statements a lot. I mean, you can have misleading statements without having any ill intent, right, behind them. You just sort of don't know what you don't know sometimes, and you make statements. This is an example of where making a statement that is inaccurate about impact, making a statement that is inaccurate about your posture, about how you're set up, your state of security throughout an event or before an event or after an event. This is the exact scenario we talk about all the time when we talk about communication. So you need to prepare for communication, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
During an outage, and that exercise alone helps you understand also where some of your vulnerabilities are. And so shame on them for having misled folks, but more importantly, shame on them for not having proper policies and processes in place,
Yeah.
cybersecurity posture level, but just
Mm-hmm.
the communication part. If you just work on that bit, it exposes so much of your vulnerabilities to you internally so you can work through it so that when something happens, you're prepared to communicate accurately and you're not misstating or misrepresenting any type of information. Because here's an example as to how it'll nip you right in the butt.
Yeah.
That's a lot of money. I wonder how much money they would have spent on cybersecurity, right? And
Yeah.
mitigated all those costs or a lot of those costs. I'm not saying they wouldn't have been breached, and I'm not saying that they wouldn't have had to face fines, but had they spent the money on their infrastructure, on their policies, their procedures, their practices, all that stuff, they
Being taken
surely would have had
reasonable.
some type of ROI when you consider the fines. And you don't know how hot fire is until you get burned. Well, here's an example. You got burned. In fact, these guys got burned twice. So they knew what fire felt like, but they still chose to
Yeah.
do it that way. So
Yeah.
that's shameful.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Speaking of getting burned twice, CDK Global,
Yeah.
they're out here in the frying pan. CDK Global, they're an SaaS platform for car dealerships. Dealerships use this for everything. It's payroll, accounts receivable, deal paperwork, finding financing, working on financing for customers. It happens all through this platform.
Okay.
There's 15,000 users of this platform in North America.
So 15,000 dealers. So
Dealerships,
car dealerships,
cars, motorsports,
motorsports.
trucks,
Gotcha.
18 wheelers, Penske, you name it.
Right.
So it was back June 30th, Tuesday night. They had a breach. They brought the systems back online Wednesday. They had another breach. So now the systems are back offline. They're working to remediate this, but they've had thousands of people affected. They're facing two that we know of right now, 2
Mhm.
lawsuits. The impact of that is quite extensive. These dealerships, they've gone back to pen and paper.
At least you hope they could go back to pen and paper on some of this, right? I'm sure there's some of
Yeah.
these things that are not realistic to go back to pen and paper because you need access to information to make certain decisions that have now been digitized.
Mm-hmm.
So CDK is one thing. Curious to understand what they're doing, what happened, what some of the risks are. But also, if I look at from the franchises, those that are working with the systems,
Mm-hmm.
there's more proof to you that you need to have continuity in place. So, we talk about business continuity, but this is,
Mm-hmm.
a continuity of systems or services that underpin your business continuity. So you have to have a game plan in place for when something happens. And sure, you can go back to pen and paper for some things, but you certainly can't do it for everything. If you've got um, maintenance records on vehicles that are part of these systems that drive the service offering that you put people through to say, hey, you've got X amount of miles, this is the service we need to do, this is what we did last time, here's this package that you need to purchase for your next service. If that's
Mm-hmm.
all tied to these types of transactions, you can go pen and paper all you'd like, but really you're not going to be very efficient and effective. It's certainly not a long-term solution that's viable. And
Yeah.
so having these systems in place is great, but having continuity is also great. It's also important. It's critical for every portion of the business that you shift over into these types of systems. The other thing to consider is a single point of failure. Having one system that has everything in there makes you very efficient. And I know the dealerships are dealing with very, very fine margins. And so it's probably very um, important for them to have the most efficient solution in that single location. But they have to ask themselves, what is the cost of inefficiency when these things go sideways? How much revenue do you lose? How much cost do you lose control on? That
Yeah.
blows the ROI out of the water for that instance and potentially for a longer duration. You'll need to recover from that loss and will take some time. So since margins are so low and they're using systems that help drive that thin margin and that maintain that thin margin, having everything in one system is something that they should maybe reconsider. Have it segregated across multiple systems. So if one fails, at least it's not all areas of your business or a significant area of your business.
Yeah. So, what's interesting as well about this is, CDK is still down. So, do they have backups? Did they test the backups? Do they have a disaster recovery plan?
And how quickly should they come up? So I read somewhere that there's some guidance being offered to them that they shouldn't restore services quickly since this has happened more than once, and doing so could compromise them again and just exacerbate the problem. So at what point do they go back up? Huge impact.
Yeah. And apparently this is pretty old, pretty ancient software, so I'm sure it's got vulnerabilities that we're not, I mean, it'll come out when the dust settles. How do they recover from something like that?
I will tell you, single points of failures are a risk. Not having continuity in place, if you're a dealer, that's a risk. If you're CDK and you have old systems, legacy systems in place, migrating to more robust and manageable solutions, migrating to the
Mm-hmm.
cloud, yes, comes with risk, but also allows you to enhance your and modernize your systems. I think people that have old systems have this great opportunity, let me tell you, because when you have a lot invested in a system, just whether it's a product or a platform or a service or something that you do, you have this tendency to say, well, now I've got to make this secure. And so it doesn't make sense financially for you to break everything, start with the security, and then build on top of that. And so you end up putting security on top of whatever it is that you're already doing. But we know now that the best practice in security is to build secure platforms and then build on top of those. So really the security strategy, the security layer should be the foundation of what you've got, and then you build on top of that. So I think the folks that have these legacy systems have great opportunity as they rebuild to build something that is built on a solid foundation of security-based platforms and then build on top of it. I
Mhm.
encourage them to take that perspective rather than saying, well, now let me build this solution that I think is great and people are going to want, and focus on the features of my solution, and then say, okay, well, we're going to bring in a security layer to sit on top of it. The
Mhm.
security layer should underpin it. It should be the root. That's a
Agree.
best practice. And so they've got this opportunity, whoever they are, to have legacy systems. As you migrate or as you change or as you overhaul or redesign, you have an opportunity to deploy something that is very secure, but you got to deploy the security first. Come up with your security strategy first, then your platform. That's cool stuff, man. Anything else going on?
I did find something else that I thought was kind of interesting this morning.
I heard Neiman Marcus got breached.
Yeah, there was a Neiman Marcus breach, 64,000 Neiman Marcus guests. There is a major Wi-Fi vulnerability in Windows that was detected that could allow malicious remote code execution. You don't even have to download anything or click on a suspicious link or anything like that. As long as they have, if they're within range of your Wi-Fi device and you don't have this patch, they can get access. Stay up on your patches.
This seems like such a simple thing, right?
Yeah.
We tell people all the time to stay up to date on your software patches and to look at your configurations to look for any type of vulnerabilities for changes. It's simple ways they catch you when your guard is down, and that's how they access stuff. And now you've got a bunch of people that have been compromised. I can only hope though that people that have all their profiles set up don't necessarily have all of their credit card information stored there locally in their profiles for easy access.
Mm-hmm.
They'll also be smart about that. End users, great to have the convenience of all these profiles, but be weary of uploading your credit card information and storing the credit card information. Yes, everybody has an obligation from a PCI perspective to store that information and mask it and make it so that it's not available, but doesn't mean it's not in a system somewhere. And it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't mean that there aren't bits and pieces of information that when they're stored can be compromised and used or as leverage for other types of account transactions, as we saw in the Amtrak Rewards situation where they were using the credential stuffing technique.
Yep.
That's how they do it. That's how they get you.
Right.
So we have to be weary as consumers.
Vigilant.
Yes. Take advantage of the features, benefits that these platforms offer us. I'm not saying not to do that. I'm just saying you don't have to say yes, 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 yes to everything. Sometimes you can say, no, opt out for certain things.
Yeah.
Oh, man, that's cool. So I think it's all the time we have for this week. Appreciate you, T, once again, going through and building
Absolutely.
this list of interesting topics for us to talk through. I'd like to thank our listeners, our viewers, for your comments, your feedback. Again, keep them coming. We really like to hear what folks have to say. You can follow us on all of the standard podcast platforms. You can follow us on YouTube, LinkedIn. Send us a comment on Instagram as well at the Cybersecurity Boardroom. We'd like to thank our sponsors, Cloud Warriors, once again for their support. Really appreciate all of that. You can reach them at cloudwarriors.ai. Thank you very much. Have a great week, T. We'll talk to you next week.
Cheers. Talk to you soon.
All right, buddy.